Welcome to a journey into the darkest corners of Nigeria's history. We are counting down the 10 most notorious, dangerous, and feared individuals who carved their names into the bedrock of this nation with violence, blood, and fear. From armed robbers who became folk heroes to kidnappers who built empires, these are the men who gave Nigeria sleepless nights. Let's begin our countdown at number 10. Number 10, Lawrence Anini, also known as the Law. In the history of Nigerian crime, few names evoke as much contradiction as Lawrence Anini. Operating in the mid-1980s, Anini was not just a criminal, he was a phenomenon who struck a strange chord between terror and adoration. Alongside his lethal partner, Monday Osunbor, Anini terrorized the old Bendel state, now known as Edo and Delta states, with a level of brazen confidence that baffled the authorities. They hijacked buses, raided banks, and engaged in gunfights with the police in broad daylight. But Anini was a master of psychological warfare. After a successful heist, he would drive through market squares and crowded streets, throwing handfuls of stolen Naira notes out of his car window to the cheering masses. This twisted Robin Hood persona confused the public and frustrated the police, creating a shield of civilian protection around him. People whispered that he possessed powerful juju that allowed him to teleport away from danger, a rumor Anini happily encouraged to build his legend. However, the invincibility of Lawrence Anini was a lie constructed on a foundation of deep police corruption. He wasn't vanishing by magic, he was being protected by high-ranking officers within the force, including the infamous Deputy Superintendent of Police, George Iyamu, who supplied the gang with weapons and intelligence. But every reign must come to an end. The turning point came on December 3, 1986, in a daring operation led by Superintendent of Police Kayode Wanaroro. Acting on intelligence rumored to have come from a betrayed girlfriend, Wanaroro stormed a house in Benin City where Anini was hiding. Caught off guard and perhaps believing his own myth, Anini tried to escape, but Wanaroro was not a man to be trifled with. He shattered Anini's leg with a barrage of bullets, grounding the law permanently. The subsequent trial was a media sensation, with Anini sitting in a wheelchair, his leg eventually amputated, confessing to his crimes and implicating his police collaborators. Justice James Omo-Agege of the Benin High Court sentenced him to death, and his execution by firing squad ended the most dramatic crime saga of the 1980s. Number 9, Hamisu Bala, better known as Wadume. Moving from the armed robbers of the South to the modern scourge of the North, we arrive at number 9. Unlike the street-level violence of Anini, Wadume represented a new, sophisticated breed of criminal, the kidnap kingpin, with connections that reached the highest levels of security. Operating primarily out of Taraba State, Wadume was a millionaire kidnapper who ran a vast network that supplied arms and terrorized the northern region. But his story is most famous not for his crimes, but for the shocking and bloody manner of his arrest. In August 2019, the Intelligence Response Team of the Inspector General of Police, an elite unit famed for tracking down high-profile criminals, successfully executed a covert operation to capture Wadume in his stronghold of Ibi. They managed to handcuff the kingpin and were transporting him to Abuja for interrogation when the unthinkable happened. As the police convoy passed through a military checkpoint, soldiers of the Nigerian army opened fire on the bus. It was a massacre that shocked the nation. The soldiers, who later claimed they mistook the elite police unit for kidnappers, unleashed a hail of bullets that killed 3 police officers and 2 civilians instantly, leaving 5 others critically wounded. In the ensuing chaos, the soldiers allegedly cut Wadume's handcuffs and allowed him to escape back into the shadows. This event exposed the terrifying lack of coordination and the deep-seated corruption within Nigeria's security architecture. For weeks, Wadume was a ghost again, but the pressure was too high for him to stay hidden forever. He was eventually tracked down to a hideout in Kano State and rearrested. On June 8, 2020, he was arraigned alongside his accomplices, finally facing justice for the chaos he had orchestrated. Number 8. Ishola Oyenusi, famously called Dr. Oyenusi. Long before Anini or Wadume, there was the original king of the underworld, a man who terrorized Lagos in the immediate aftermath of the Nigerian Civil War. At number 8 is Ishola Oyenusi, often called Dr. Oyenusi, though he held no medical degree. Oyenusi was the pioneer of violent armed robbery in Nigeria, a cold-blooded killer who struck fear into the hearts of Lagosians in the early 1970s. His arrogance was legendary. He famously told a journalist that "the bullet has no power over me," a claim he truly seemed to believe. His gang was responsible for a string of brutal carjackings, bank heists, and murders, operating with a level of organization that the war-weary police force struggled to match. His downfall came after a robbery at the Wahum factory in Ikea, where a police officer was killed. When Oyenusi was finally caught, the government decided to make an example of him to deter the rising wave of crime. On September 8, 1971, the famous Lagos Bar Beach was transformed into an execution ground. Over 30,000 Nigerians flocked to the beach, climbing on cars and pushing against barriers to catch a glimpse of the invincible doctor. As the cameras flashed and the crowd roared, Oyenusi did something that chilled the spine of everyone watching. He smiled. Even as the soldiers took aim, he maintained a look of defiant arrogance, a final act of psychological warfare against the society he had terrorized. The volley of bullets that followed finally wiped that smile from his face, proving that no man is above the ultimate law of mortality.
Number 7. Shina Rambo. If Oyenusi was the pioneer, our number 7 entry was the stuff of nightmares and urban legends. The name alone was enough to send market women in the southwest scrambling to lock their shops in the 1990s. Born in Abeokuta, Ogun State, Shina Rambo wasn't just a robber. He was a terror machine who treated robbery like a military operation. He was infamous for snatching exotic cars and robbing banks with heavy weaponry, but what made him truly terrifying was his deep immersion in the occult. Stories circulated that he pounded babies in mortars to make charms, that he could disappear into thin air, and that police bullets would simply bounce off his chest. He was a criminal who blurred the line between reality and mythology, making the police terrified to even engage him. But the story of Shina Rambo has perhaps the most bizarre twist in Nigerian criminal history. After years of terrorizing the southwest and evading capture despite a massive manhunt, reports surfaced that he had been killed in a shootout. The police celebrated, the public sighed in relief. Yet, years later, a man named Matthew Oluwanifemi stepped forward, claiming to be the real Shina Rambo. This man was not in handcuffs, he was holding a Bible. He claimed that after spending time in prison and witnessing the power of God, he had repented and become an evangelist. Whether the man preaching the gospel today is the true demon of the 90s remains a subject of intense debate, but the legend of Shina Rambo remains an unforgettable chapter of blood and mystery. Number 6. Mighty Joe, also known as Isiaka Busari. Returning to the violent days of the 1970s, at number 6 we find a man who inherited a kingdom of blood. Mighty Joe, born Isiaka Busari, was the second in command to the notorious Dr. Oyenusi. When Oyenusi was executed at the Bar Beach, many hoped the gang would crumble. Instead, Mighty Joe stepped up to the throne. He was a different kind of beast, physically imposing, formerly a street boxer and political thug in Lagos. Mighty Joe reorganized the remnants of the gang, recruiting ex-military personnel to add tactical precision to their brutality. For years after Oyenusi's death, Mighty Joe ensured that Lagos remained a danger zone, proving that the execution of one leader does not kill the ideology of crime. His reign, however, was shorter than his predecessors. In 1973, Mighty Joe was apprehended not during a high-stakes bank robbery, but after being caught attempting to rob a bar attendant. It was a humiliating end for a kingpin. Like his former boss, he was sentenced to death. On June 6, 1973, he too was dragged to the Lagos Bar Beach. As he faced the firing squad, reports say he converted to Islam moments before his death, praying for forgiveness. The bullets that tore through him signaled the end of the Oyenusi Joe era, closing the first major chapter of armed robbery in post-independence Nigeria. We are halfway through the list and the stories are only getting darker. From the charms of Shina Rambo to the brazenness of Anini, these men held absolute power for a short time. Before we continue, I have a question for you. As we move into the modern era of crime, do you think the methods of the Nigerian police have improved since the days of firing squads at the Bar Beach? Write the word improved or worse in the comment section right now. I want to hear your thoughts on how crime fighting has changed. Number 5. Tewase Akwaza, better known as Ghana. We move now to the middle belt of Nigeria, to the lush but blood-soaked lands of Benin State. At number 5 is Tewase Akwaza, better known as Ghana. Unlike the urban robbers of Lagos, Ghana was a warlord. For over a decade, he led a ruthless militia that effectively controlled huge swathes of Benin State, engaging in everything from cattle rustling and highway robbery to mass kidnappings and assassinations. He levied taxes on farmers, decided who could live in certain villages, and became a de facto government in the shadows. His rise was fueled by the complex communal conflicts of the region, but his methods were pure criminality. He was accused of burying people alive and massacring entire communities that refused to pay him homage. The government placed a 50 million naira bounty on his head, but Ghana remained elusive, hiding in the thick forests where he knew every path and cave. However, in a twist of fate similar to Wadume, his end came when he tried to embrace peace. On September 8, 2020, Ghana emerged from the forest to accept an amnesty deal offered by the state government. He was on his way to Makudi to surrender formally when his convoy was intercepted by the military. Unlike the amnesty he expected, Ghana met his death. The military claimed he was killed in a shootout after trying to escape, while his supporters claimed it was an extrajudicial execution of a man who had surrendered. Regardless of the controversy, the death of Ghana brought a tense silence to the forests of Benin.
Number 4. Godogodo Egunjobi, known as Godogodo. At number 4, we have the modern incarnation of Lawrence Anini, a man who held the Southwest in a grip of terror for over a decade. Godogodo Egunjobi, known in the underworld as Godogodo. Godogodo was not your typical robber. He was a scrap dealer turned cold-blooded killer. After spending years in prison for a minor crime, he came out hardened, bitter, and missing one eye. He decided he would never return to prison alive. Godogodo rose to become the boss of bosses in the Lagos armed robbery scene. He was known for his ability to handle an AK-47 with one hand and his absolute lack of mercy. He didn't just rob, he killed policemen for sport, bragging that he had killed over 100 officers during his career because he hated the police for his earlier imprisonment. Godogodo was a master of disguise, living a quiet life in Ibadan as a property owner while coordinating bloody bank robberies in Lagos. He evaded capture for 14 years, a staggering amount of time for a high-profile criminal. But on August 1, 2013, the game ended. The relentless SARS commander Abba Kyari tracked him to his mansion in Ibadan. Godogodo didn't go down easily. He engaged the police in a fierce gun battle, but was eventually overpowered. Seeing the feared one-eyed assassin paraded in handcuffs, looking like a frail old man, was a shock to the millions of Lagosians who had lived in fear of his name. Number 3. Okuduli Ndiwe, famously known as Deriko Nwamama. If you lived in eastern Nigeria, specifically Onitsha in the early 2000s, the name Deriko Nwamama was synonymous with death. At number 3, we have the vampire of the East. Okuduli Ndiwe was only 22 years old when he became the most feared man in Anambra State.
Rising from a street urchin to an armed robbery kingpin, Derrico turned the commercial hub of Onitsha into his personal fiefdom. He robbed luxurious buses, sacked banks, and killed with reckless abandon. It is estimated that he personally killed over 100 civilians and countless policemen. He boasted that he was invincible, protected by powerful charms that made him untouchable by conventional law enforcement. The police were helpless against Derrico. The fear was so palpable that the state government eventually turned to a vigilante group known as the Bakassi Boys. These were not police officers, they were jungle justice personified, armed with machetes and mystical beliefs of their own. On July 3, 2001, the Bakassi Boys ambushed Derrico. The invincible kingpin was captured. 6 days later, on July 9, 2001, he was dragged to the Ochanja market. In front of a cheering crowd that had suffered under his tyranny, the Bakassi Boys did not read him his rights. They delivered instantaneous, brutal jungle justice. Derrico was beheaded in broad daylight, a gruesome message that the reign of the armed robber was over. It remains one of the most violent spectacles of public justice in modern Nigerian history.
Number 2. Abubakar Shekau. We now enter a realm of criminality that transcends robbery and enters the domain of war. At number 2 is Abubakar Shekau, the deranged leader of Boko Haram. Following the death of the group's founder, Mohammed Yusuf, in 2009, Shekau took command and transformed a radical sect into one of the deadliest terrorist organizations on the planet. For over a decade, Shekau held the northeast of Nigeria hostage. He was responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Nigerians and the displacement of millions. His crimes were not just theft, they were crimes against humanity. Suicide bombings in markets, the slaughter of schoolboys, and the infamous abduction of 276 schoolgirls from Chibok in 2014, an act that sparked global outrage. Shekau was a master of survival. The Nigerian military claimed to have killed him multiple times, only for him to reappear in videos, mocking the generals and boasting of his vitality. He seemed like a cockroach that could not be crushed. But even monsters have predators. In May 2021, Shekau was cornered not by the Nigerian army, but by a rival terrorist faction, ISWAP, in the Sambisa forest. Faced with capture and humiliation by his rivals, Shekau reportedly detonated a suicide vest, killing himself instantly. The man who had sent thousands to their deaths via suicide bombers finally tasted his own medicine, ending a dark chapter of insurgency, though the war he started tragically continues. Chukwudememe Onwomadike, better known as Evans. And finally, at number 1, we have the man who turned kidnapping into a corporate enterprise. Chukwudememe Onwomadike, known to the world as Evans. While Shekau was a terrorist and Anini was a robber, Evans was a billionaire kidnapper. He didn't rob banks, he kidnapped the people who owned the banks. Operating with a sophistication never before seen, Evans targeted the ultra-wealthy, demanding ransoms not in Naira, but in US dollars. We are talking about ransoms of $1 million US paid by families desperate to see their loved ones again. He lived like a king in a mansion in Magodo, Lagos, surrounded by luxury, while his victims were chained in secret dungeons for months. Evans was the most wanted man in 3 states, evading capture for 4 years thanks to a network of informants that allegedly included rogue police officers. But in 2017, the intelligence response team, led by Abba Kyari, finally cracked the code. They raided his mansion and captured the billionaire in his bedroom. The trial was a spectacle. Evans, the man who had inflicted so much pain, broke down in tears in court, begging for mercy. But the law has a long memory. On February 25, 2022, the Lagos State High Court found him guilty of kidnapping and conspiracy. The judge, noting his lack of genuine remorse and the overwhelming evidence, sentenced him to life imprisonment. The king of kidnappers had lost his crown, trading his mansion for a prison cell forever. From the firing squads of the 1970s to the high-tech tracking of the 2020s, the story of these 10 men is a mirror of Nigeria's history. It is a story of how greed, desperation, and the lust for power can twist men into monsters. But there's a lesson here that is louder than the gunshots. Every single name on this list, whether they used juju, bribed police, or hid in forests, met a tragic end. Anini lost his leg and his life. Oyenusi was humiliated at the stake. Evans is rotting in a cell. Crime may offer a flash of wealth and a moment of power, but the invoice always comes due, and the price is your life. Thank you for watching this deep dive into history. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please subscribe and turn on notifications.